Live from the Madison headquarters of the State Bar of Wisconsin, News 3 Now presents the 2022 Attorney General Debate with Democratic incumbent Attorney General Josh Kaul and Republican challenger Eric Toney. Here's moderator Eric Franke.
And good afternoon and welcome from our host, the State Bar of Wisconsin. We are proud to sponsor this debate at WISC TV along with our partners at WisPolitics.com, this debate between the candidates for Attorney General in Wisconsin. We also want to welcome our viewers from WKBT TV in La Crosse and statewide on Wisconsin Eye, and our in-person guests here as well in the auditorium at the State Bar. On Tuesday, November 8th, Wisconsin voters will choose between these two candidates for Attorney General. Incumbent Josh Kaul has served as the 45th Attorney General of Wisconsin since January of 2019. The son of former Attorney General Peg Lautenschlager, after growing up in Oshkosh and Fond du Lac, Josh Kaul received his undergraduate degrees from Yale before attending Stanford Law School, then worked as a federal prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Baltimore. He then returned to Wisconsin to work at a Madison law firm before running for office. Challenger Eric Toney has served as Fond du Lac District Attorney since 2013. Mr. Toney's father served in law enforcement for over 30 years. A Fond du Lac native, he attended St. Norbert College in De Pere, then on to law school at Hamline University, and worked at a Fond du Lac law firm before running for office. Gentlemen, thanks to both of you for being with us today. We appreciate your participation. Again, we remind our audience to quiet their electronic devices and allow our candidates to answer the questions quietly today. Here are some rules we want to go over for on the debate, to which everyone has agreed. We will have 1 minute opening and 1 minute closing remarks. We will then have questions from 3 journalists after the opening statement. Each candidate will then be given 1 minute to respond with an opportunity for a 30-second rebuttal if a candidate mentions their opponent in the response to the question. As moderator, I will have the final call on if additional rebuttal time is to be allowed today. Candidates will receive time cues from a monitor here on the floor at the State Bar. The order of response for the opening and closing statements was determined by a coin toss. Mr. Toney won the toss, chose to have the final closing argument, so Mr. Kaul will have the first opening statement. Mr. Kaul, you may begin.
Great. Well, first and foremost, thank you to the State Bar for hosting this event. Thank you to our panelists for being here today, and thank you to everybody who's watching this debate. I grew up in Oshkosh and Fond du Lac in a family that was deeply involved in public service. My mom served as a prosecutor and elected official. My stepdad, Bill, was a police officer in Neenah. And I've had the privilege of serving the public as a federal prosecutor, where I prosecuted murderers, gang members, and drug traffickers, and worked to make communities safer. I've also gone to court to work to fight against laws that restricted access to voting. And for the last 4 years, I've had the privilege of serving as Attorney General. I'm a husband, a father, and as your Attorney General, my top priority has been public safety. We have investigated and prosecuted some of the most serious crimes in the state of Wisconsin during the course of my administration. We've also delivered on issue after issue that we talked about in 2018, working to reform our sexual assault kit laws, hold Big Pharma accountable for its role in the opioid epidemic, hold polluters accountable, and work to make our schools safer.
Mr. Kaul, thank you. Mr. Toney, your opening statement.
Thank you. I'm in my 10th year as the Fond du Lac County District Attorney, and I also serve as the president of the Wisconsin District Attorneys Association, a bipartisan group of prosecutors across Wisconsin. My dad spent over 30 years as a police officer, and public service runs in our family. You name it, I have personally prosecuted it: cold case homicides, sexual assault, domestic violence, racketeering, complex drug conspiracies, and I'm proud to be law enforcement's choice with 83% of our Wisconsin sheriffs that have endorsed me, and it's bipartisan. Republican and Democrat sheriffs from across Wisconsin, where I have nearly as many Democrat law enforcement endorsements as my opponent has total. And law enforcement has seen the public safety failures over the last 4 years from our Attorney General, who has left special agent positions unfilled, criminal litigation prosecutors unfilled, and he's failed at his #1 campaign promise of fixing our crime labs, taking over twice as long as former Attorney General Brad Schimmel to process DNA evidence, and that's why we need a prosecutor and not a politician leading our Department of Justice.
Mr. Toney, thank you. I want to take some time now to introduce our panelists. They will be asking the questions today. political reporter Will Keneally of WISC TV News 3 Now here in Madison, Emily Fannin of WDJT TV, CBS 58 in Milwaukee, and J.R. Ross, editor at WISPolitics.com. And we begin the questions with J.R.
Gentlemen, both, thank you for being here today. We're going to talk about Department of Justice resources to start. I'm asking the same question in a different way, so bear with us a little bit here. Mr. Kaul, you are seeking nearly $96 million more in state aid for the Department of Justice in the upcoming budget. That would be a boost of more than 60% in general purpose revenue. Your letter to the Evers administration, you say the purpose was to put together, this was put together to focus on fighting crime through additional services at DOJ, as well as help for locals. 2 years ago, you sought more than $32 million in additional general purpose revenue. Why are you only now seeking such a dramatic increase in state aid?
Yeah, so back in November of last year, almost a year ago at this point, I released my Safer Wisconsin plan. It is critical that we invest in law enforcement and public safety across the state of Wisconsin. The level of violence that we have seen in Milwaukee and in communities across the country is unacceptable. Unfortunately, we have had underfunding of public safety in Wisconsin for decades now. My Safer Wisconsin plan would invest over $115 million in communities across the state of Wisconsin into things like community policing and prosecution, officer wellness, recruitment and retention, victim services, and mental health crisis response. The budget that you're referring to takes a lot of those proposals and includes it. Those are resources that would go to local law enforcement and communities across the state. We also asked for more DCI agents at DOJ. We need those resources. We also need to increase shared revenue, money from the state to communities, and that's a big difference in this race. I have proposed concrete solutions for funding law enforcement. My opponent has not been willing to do that.
Now, Mr. Toney, to a little different twist on this question for you is, when you've talked about resources for the agency, you've talked about how it's more likely Republican lawmakers would invest in DOJ with you in charge than give money to Milwaukee, for example, to fight crime. You said that they want a partner, someone they can trust to partner with. Yet I look on your website, you only have 6 endorsements from Republican lawmakers, none of whom are in leadership. Why? What evidence do you have that you would be a more trusted partner when it comes to DOJ resources if elected?
That's the difference. I'm a prosecutor, not a politician. I haven't sought those endorsements. I've sought the endorsements from law enforcement across Wisconsin, and they have lined up behind me in droves, including the Wisconsin Troopers Association, the Wisconsin Fraternal Order of Police, and police agencies and district attorneys and sheriffs across Wisconsin. That's why we need somebody that law enforcement trusts that can work with our legislature, not waiting until an election year to put forward a budget. And we've seen our Attorney General leave these DCI positions unfilled. His own director of the Division of Criminal Investigation in March at a sheriff's conference said only 88 out of 113 of those positions are unfilled, and they have not answered the question. We've asked that their organizational charts be released. The Attorney General has refused to do it. He's left nearly 30% of the criminal litigation prosecutors unfilled, according to a Wisconsin State Journal article earlier this year. We need someone that's going to be serious about public safety, not give it lip service.
Mr. Kaul, would you like to rebut?
Yeah, you know, as Attorney General, what you say has to be accurate. And at the last debate that we had, the moderator fact-checked Mr. Toney on the claims he just made. He knows the facts, and what he's saying is false. He knows that. As Attorney General, you have to tell the truth. The truth of the matter is that 81 out of the 90 special agent positions were filled, and we're in the process of filling 12 more. But under Brad Schimmel, we didn't see those kinds of investments in law enforcement and public safety. We have begun to see them in my administration with 70 additional prosecutor positions added in the budgets that were passed while I've been AG, as well as investment in law enforcement officer training. We've been getting results. We need to do more, but we need to build on the progress we're making, not go backwards.
All right, our next question comes from Will Keneally.
So we'll turn now to crime. First to you, Mr. Toney. The Department of Justice often operates more as one of the state's largest law firms than a true crime-fighting organization. Still, the AG is often referred to as the state's top cop. From the Division of Criminal Investigation to crime labs, it is also a significant resource for local law enforcement. So for you, what is the number one thing that the DOJ could do over the next 4 years to assist local law enforcement?
Well, the number one thing the DOJ can do is make sure the special agent, DCI, Division of Criminal Investigation positions are filled, and he didn't answer the question. He said 90. They have well over 90 positions at the Division of Criminal Investigation. The Attorney General knows it. He won't release the data. He's left prosecutor positions unfilled. We saw a consequence of that in Oconto County, where the DA was on leave, And the Brown County District Attorney's Office had to take over prosecution in that county because the Attorney General's office didn't have the resources to spare. We have prosecutor shortages across Wisconsin. We rely on our Department of Justice. We rely on the crime lab. He broke his #1 campaign promise and said he was going to fix the crime labs, and he's taking over twice as long to process less DNA. He's failed at his #1 promise. We need an Attorney General that is going to prioritize public safety, working with law enforcement, and law enforcement across Wisconsin. Trust me to do that here in Wisconsin.
Same question.
You asked what the Attorney General should do, and what you heard from my opponent was mostly attacks and a few vague platitudes, no plans. That's one of the big differences in this race. Our crime-fighting budget would invest tens of millions of dollars, in fact, over $100 million total, in public safety. Our AG needs to be a leader in fighting to get those resources to law enforcement and to communities across the state of Wisconsin. But my opponent has been unwilling to stand up to Republicans in the legislature, call on them to increase shared revenue. I hope he does that today. He hasn't called on them to make the kinds of investments I've proposed in my Safer Wisconsin plan. We also need to pass some common sense gun safety legislation. Right now, you can sell guns out of the trunk of your car. And you can on top of that, we need to strengthen our bail system.
Would you like to rebut?
Thank you. You know, I put out a plan last year in October, early November, that we need to give our Attorney General's office original prosecution authority over Milwaukee County. I've sat across from enough parents that have had to bury their child, including those in Milwaukee who have no idea who's murdered their children. We need an Attorney General that's going to be serious. People don't feel safe in their homes. They don't feel safe in their vehicles. They won't let their kids go to parks because they're afraid of stray bullets. And he's cut resources, making it more difficult for law enforcement and prosecutors across Wisconsin. We need someone that's going to actually take action, not give it lip service.
If you're going to enforce it, I would encourage you to enforce it both ways.
Yeah. Emily, you have the next question. Emily Fannin from CBS 58 Milwaukee.
Mr. Kaul, Republicans have called for the removal of Milwaukee District Attorney John Chisholm over the low bail set for Darrell Brooks, the man who is now convicted in the Waukesha Christmas parade tragedy. Do you believe there is cause to remove Chisholm as district attorney, and are there other prosecutors you think should meet a similar fate?
First, what happened in Waukesha is a horrific tragedy, and my heart goes out to the victims who've been impacted by that. I was glad to see that Mr. Brooks was convicted yesterday, and he's going to face a very serious sentence in that case. What we need to do is to reform our bail system. As a federal prosecutor, the system I worked under is one where if you were a danger to the community, you didn't get bail at a certain amount. So if you were a drug kingpin or somebody who was wealthy who committed a crime, you couldn't buy your way out of prison. You were simply detained pending trial. I have been advocating for that kind of change since I've been in office, and we need to make that change. Now, voters elect DAs in counties across the state. That's the system that we have had. We don't want a system where our governor is firing DAs around the state where he disagrees with them. That would take power away from the voters. And so I think it is the voters who should make those decisions. What I don't think we should have is what my opponent has suggested, which is DAs going across county lines to prosecute people for abortions, having roving abortion ban enforcers. That's what he suggested. That's not what we need to be doing.
Mr. Toney?
We have an attorney general that speaks without the facts. I'd encourage you to read the Cap Times article from Jack Kelly, where he put the full quote out there, where I never made that proposal. But when we talk about Waukesha and the parade massacre and D.A. Chisholm, Chapter 17, I think 1711, allows the governor to suspend a district attorney or sheriff if they refuse or neglect to perform their duties and they have due process. We saw a DA that was appointed by Governor Evers in Waushara County not show up to work. That is a circumstance where the governor should have suspended the district attorney, had an investigation, because the people of Waushara County deserve to have a district attorney that would prosecute crime in their community. The massacre at the Waukesha parade was horrific, and so many families were impacted, the physical and emotional damage. The great prosecutors and first responders that fought for justice in that trial, they did such a tremendous job, and I'm proud to do that as a district attorney, working hand in hand with our law enforcement to keep our community safe.
Well, I certainly agree that if a DA is just not showing up to work or doing their job, they should be removed. What I think is important to note, though, is Mr. Toney said directly to the camera, he's on video saying that one of the things he thinks we should consider is to allow DAs to cross county lines. It's another example of this point that as Attorney General, what you say matters. You don't get to walk it back weeks later because people will make policy decisions based on what you've said.
JR has the next question.
Mr. Toney, the latest DOJ report found the state's crime lab processed more cases in 2021 than the year previously, but took longer to process them. That comes on the heels of DOJ having mixed success convincing the Republican-controlled legislature to dedicate more resources toward the lab. Can you give me a couple examples of what you would do, your top priorities, to improve the lab's performances in this next budget?
Well, I think the premise of your question is incorrect, because right now the crime labs have more or equal resources that Brad Schimmel had when he was our Attorney General. And to give you an example, in DNA alone, the Attorney General is testing a couple thousand less items than Brad Schimmel. And Brad Schimmel did it in about 50 days for the average turnaround time. It's taking our Attorney General 115 days to test thousands of less items. And so we have the tools and resources there to improve the efficiency. We need an Attorney General that's actually willing to work with the great analysts and employees at our crime labs to make sure that we are making it as efficient as possible. And they're even limiting what law enforcement and prosecutors can send. And I hear stories, and I've seen this myself, where we'll ask for something to be tested, and they'll tell us no and ask us to explain why we need it tested. And then they'll say, no, we don't think you need that to prove your case. We shouldn't have analysts micromanaging district attorneys that have to prove these cases beyond a reasonable doubt. And despite throttling the number of items, they're still taking longer to do it, and we need someone that is going to fix our crime labs.
Once again, what you heard are attacks and not solutions. Here's the reality, though. First, our DNA analysis, the number of cases that are waiting to be tested has dropped dramatically in my time in office. And what that means is that the number of cases where an investigator or a prosecutor is waiting for evidence to help solve their case has gone down. That's happened despite a pandemic, and it's also happened despite the fact that we have enhanced the capability of our DNA testing. We now conduct probabilistic genotyping, and what that means is that we are able to get DNA matches in more cases. So we are able to solve more cases because of our enhancements.
Was that, I believe you had a minute there. I think we might have had a timing error there. First, you had an extra 30 seconds. The time expired too early. If you want to just finish quickly.
Well, we have also requested additional resources for our state crime labs. We've gotten some resources, but less than half of the resources that we've requested. As testing becomes more complex, as it did with DNA, or as it has with toxicology testing, we increased or improved our instrumentation there so that we could detect even really small amounts of fentanyl, which is key to helping us fight the opioid epidemic. We need to get those resources that go with it.
Mr. Toney, I want to give you 30 seconds just because of the timing issue.
He campaigned on the opioid epidemic 4 years ago, attacking Brad Schimmel. Almost, I think, over 40% increase in opioid deaths here in Wisconsin. And he made all of these attacks 4 years ago. He's failed to address the opioid epidemic. He's failed to address our crime labs. And we need an attorney. You know, I've used about every resource our Department of Justice has to offer as a district attorney, know how to work with our law enforcement to best deploy those resources. That's why law enforcement, bipartisan law enforcement, has lined up behind me, because they trust me to lead our Department of Justice.
All right, next question from Will will be directed first, 1 minute, to Mr. Kaul.
Yeah, Mr. Kaul. So we've seen a claim this campaign that the DOJ has a backlog of handling cases that law enforcement agencies refer to it regarding internet crimes against children. I'll ask you both a series of questions. Does this backlog exist? How do you know so? And what would you do to address the problem?
Well, first and foremost, keeping our kids safe is our top priority. My kids are 8 and 5, and we need to do everything we can to make sure our kids are safe. At the Department of Justice, every tip we receive, we have reviewed. And what we do is we prioritize the cases where the information that we're receiving could lead to harm to a child. And, you know, I'm glad that this issue has come up in this campaign, because the truth of the matter is this program is an incredible success, and it doesn't get the attention that it should. We lead the Wisconsin Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force. That task force is responsible for over 1,400 arrests in my first 3 years in office. That's an increase in the number of arrests versus the Schimmel administration. Now, it is true that the number of tips has increased dramatically over years as the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has been able to identify an increasing number of tips. But despite that, we have been able to ensure that every tip is quickly reviewed. We asked for more resources in my first budget. The legislature rejected one of the positions. We've continued to ask for more resources.
That's time's up. Will, to Mr. Toney.
Same question to you. Does the backlog exist? How do you know so? And what would you do to address the problem?
It's a simple yes or no answer. And yes, the backlog exists. How do I know it? From DCI, DOJ, employees, current and former that have talked with me as a district attorney, president of our Wisconsin District Attorneys Association. Now, there's a difference between review and investigate. When he says review, what he's referring to is the initial triage to see, is this a case where a child could be about to be sexually assaulted, maybe trafficked, child enticement? But then there's a whole host of child pornography downloading, manufacturing, distributing. These cases are not investigated. They need to do subpoenas. They need to be assigned to law enforcement. That has not happened. We did an open records request 2 weeks ago, and they won't even give us the information on when those referrals were assigned. They said, we don't need to give you that information. They only gave us the referrals received, not when it was assigned. He refuses to answer the question. It's a yes or a no. Are you behind more than 1,000 referrals that have not been assigned for investigation? Because families deserve to have an answer to this issue.
Mr. Kaul, 30 seconds.
Mr. Toney doesn't understand what he's talking about, and he's misrepresenting the facts. Here's what happens. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children prioritized the cases they're sending us. Any case that could involve harm to a child is immediately prioritized and is reviewed within hours. We then additionally do our own triage so that the cases that we regard as the most serious are reviewed quickly. Then on top of that, the other cases go out for investigation. They might require administrative subpoenas. They might require us to work with law enforcement. For example, we arrested a judge in Milwaukee County who was distributing child pornography. The bottom line is that this program is a success and is keeping Wisconsinites safe.
Thank you, Mr. Kaul. Will, I understand you have the next question as well.
That's correct.
Starting with Mr. Toney.
We'll go to Mr. Toney first. Unfilled positions at the Division of Criminal Investigation is at its lowest since 2016, according to data from the DOJ. How do you specifically address staffing shortages, and do you believe that it is putting a burden on local law enforcement?
I want to circle back to the previous question where he didn't answer it. It's a yes or a no. And I hope the panel follows up with that. But how do we address the DCI shortage? The response we heard from our Attorney General was, this is how we've always done it. During historic violence and a drug epidemic with fentanyl killing at historic rates, we can't do things how we've always done it. We do what local law enforcement does. We make sure whenever there is a vacancy at the Division of Criminal Investigation, we begin to fill it immediately, to not leave nearly 25% vacancy rate at the Division of Criminal Investigation. These are the agents that investigate arson, cold case homicide. They investigate fentanyl overdoses, drug conspiracies, some officer-involved shootings. They investigate the most complex crimes in Wisconsin. We heard the Eau Claire field office for the Division of Criminal Investigation half-staffed, only 8 out of 16 agents. We need an Attorney General that's going to make this a priority and never allow this to happen again. And those numbers come from his own director, Tina Virgil, who said they're at 88 out of 113, and that was in March. And I think the numbers have gotten worse.
Thank you, Mr. Toney.
You can't have our state's top cop knowing that what he's saying is false and continuing to repeat it. That would be an awful position for our state to be in, and yet that is what Mr. Toney's doing. We have had higher staffing numbers overall, close, but slightly higher than the Schimmel administration did in DCI. We are in the process right now of hiring 12 DCI agents, so we will soon be at full staffing, in fact, excess staffing in our Division of Criminal Investigation. He is right about one thing. We investigate and prosecute the most serious crimes in the state of Wisconsin. And I am proud of our record of putting murderers, drug traffickers, and sex offenders behind bars. Our Division of Criminal Investigation does outstanding work. They have done that throughout my administration, and they're going to keep doing it over the next 4 years.
Thank you, Mr. Kaul. Mr. Toney, would you like a rebuttal?
You know, liars figure and figures lie, and that's exactly what he's doing, putting out information about special agent positions. He doesn't talk about the special agent in charge positions, about 13 or 14 of those, the 4 director positions, the administrator and deputy administrator positions, the vacancies. Every single one of those administrator and director positions have left since he started to bring in new people because of his failed leadership at the Division of Criminal Investigation, where law enforcement is desperate for a top cop that they can trust to make public safety the #1 priority here in Wisconsin, and he refuses to answer the question, 88 out of 113.
Thank you, Mr. Toney. Emily Fannin with our next line of questioning.
Gentlemen, let's move to the issue of abortion. Kaul, you will go first. Mr. Kaul, excuse me. You have said that the DOJ won't use any resources to enforce the state's 173-year-old state criminal abortion ban. Yet the department defended a decision by the Labor Industry Review Commission that a racing company had violated the state's fair employment law by denying employment to a man who had been convicted of 8 counts of sexual assault, strangulation, and battery. In that specific case, your campaign said the department had an obligation to defend the commission's decision. So why does the department have the discretion to not defend a state law, but an obligation to advocate for an employment of someone with that kind of criminal history?
Yeah, so we have an obligation to defend state law and state agency decisions, and we do that whether or not I agree with those state agency decisions or the state law, and that's part of the role of being Attorney General. What we don't have an obligation to do is to use our enforcement resources in a particular way when we are going out and affirmatively investigating and prosecuting people. We investigate and prosecute the most serious crimes in the state of Wisconsin, so we always have to make decisions about where we're putting our resources. I believe they should go to investigating and prosecuting homicides, sexual assaults, drug trafficking cases, the most serious crimes in the state. My opponent has been clear that he believes those resources should go towards going after people for abortions. I think that is a severe misuse of resources, but worse than that, it would put the health, safety, and freedom of women in Wisconsin at risk. He said he would help lead those efforts as Attorney General. He wants authority to prosecute abortion cases directly from our Department of Justice, and he has said, no matter what he's saying today, that he's proposed empowering DAs to prosecute cases in other counties for abortion.
Thank you, Mr.
That is a huge misuse of resources.
Thank you, Mr. Kaul.
It's interesting watching someone tie themselves up like a pretzel where he had to defend that but doesn't have to defend the rule of law because he disagrees with it. The rule of law is what separates America from the world. We enforce the rule of law not just when we agree. That's what my track record is as a district attorney. If you paid attention to the Republican primary, I was attacked for enforcing the rule of law, and I did not back down even if I disagreed. I have sat across from survivors of sexual assault, and I know that pain doesn't go away after 3 months, 12 months, 2 years, 5 years. We need to make sure they have the resources, that they are supported, and I've said I will defend any additional exception that the legislature passes. The governor of Wisconsin said he wouldn't even sign an exception that had rape or incest because it didn't go far enough. We need an attorney general that's not going to pick and choose when to enforce the rule of law, even if they disagree, because that's what we expect in the courtroom. Equal justice under the law for all, not just when you agree.
Mr. Toney, this question is also for you on the same topic. You have said in a recent interview that you believe district attorneys in adjoining counties should be able to cross county lines and prosecute violations of the Wisconsin's criminal abortion ban if a local DA denies to take that case. Now, state law currently doesn't give DAs the authority to cross county lines to prosecute crimes such as drug offenses or homicides, except in very narrow instances, which typically needs an order from a judge. Why would you single out a violation of the abortion statute to give DAs that power?
Well, again, the premise of the question is incorrect because the full context of the quote was asked about DAs that wouldn't prosecute certain crimes. And we have a couple statutes on the books right now, election fraud and state ethics codes, that actually allow a district attorney to prosecute in an adjoining county if the DA of that county refuses to prosecute. So I use it as an analogy to say our attorney general should have authority if a DA is refusing to prosecute, and that would be another option. I never expressly advocated for it. We were talking about the authority of the attorney general, where our attorney general has advocated for the attorney general to have original jurisdiction across the entire state of Wisconsin, which would give the attorney general the authority to prosecute and enforce the abortion ban in every single county in Wisconsin. I've said the attorney general needs that authority for Milwaukee County to direct resources there to end the historic violence and drug epidemic. And that is how we best deploy our resources, because he's depleted resources from DCI and prosecutors. So if we want to talk about resources, he has failed us, leaving key positions unfilled during historic violence and a drug epidemic.
Thank you, Mr. Toney.
Well, first, I encourage you in your shows to run the clip of Mr. Toney saying that he wants to empower people in the neighboring counties to prosecute people for abortions. But the point he made about original authority, I think, really reflects the difference in the two of us when it comes to enforcing our criminal laws. I think the AG should have original jurisdiction to prosecute cases to go after serious crimes, to put murderers and drug traffickers and gang members behind bars. Mr. Toney has suggested it for abortion prosecutions. Our AG needs to have public safety as his top priority, not a far-right radical agenda that wants to make sure that a law with no exceptions for rape or incest or even to protect the health of the mother unless it's necessary to save the life of the mother, not to make sure that that kind of draconian law is enforced, putting the health and safety and freedom of women at Wisconsin at risk.
30 seconds, Mr. Toney.
What you just heard is the Attorney General calling a district attorney a radical because we would enforce the rule of law. He disagrees with the law, so that makes you a radical. You know, the Republican Party was founded on ending slavery in America, and they were called radical Republicans then. Equal justice under the law for all, not picking and choosing. When I do a jury trial, a criminal trial, I don't think you've done one here in Wisconsin, but I ask the jurors, will you enforce the law? They say yes. Would any of you not enforce the law if you disagreed? None of them raised their hand. We need an attorney general that will enforce the rule of law.
Thank you, Mr. Toney. Next question from J.R. Ross.
Mr. Kaul, do you believe the 1849 abortion ban opens the door to prosecuting Wisconsin women or doctors who cross state lines either to obtain an abortion or perform one?
I think as the law currently stands, the answer is no to that question. The law specifically applies to actions in the state of Wisconsin. But when you heard Mr. Toney say he would enforce the law, whatever it is, he talked about exceptions for rape or incest, which don't exist in the current law. If Tim Michels and Eric Toney are elected to office, not only are they not going to add exceptions for cases of rape and incest, they're going to go further and make the law even more restrictive. They may very well put in place restrictions for people who try to leave the state. They may very well narrow the exceptions to save the life of the mother. The Susan B. Anthony group, which has endorsed Mr. Toney, and he bragged about their endorsement, wants to further restrict the laws. They want to get rid of certain forms of contraception, including IVF. That is the kind of taking Wisconsin backwards policy that we don't need for the health, the safety of Wisconsin women, or for the future of the state of Wisconsin.
Thank you, Mr. Kaul.
No, the law does not allow for the prosecution of a woman. It doesn't allow for a prosecution across state lines, and that will not happen with me as the Attorney General because I follow the rule of law. I also trust our prosecutors across Wisconsin to use their discretion and handle things on a case-by-case basis because we have amazing prosecutors across Wisconsin, and that's what we do in every single case type, a case-by-case basis with discretion. And we have an attorney general that wants, again, to pick and choose. I've never had a juror raise their hand and say, well, I don't like the law, so I'm not going to follow the instructions from the judge. But that's effectively what our attorney general is doing, is saying he doesn't like the law, so he's not going to enforce it. I wish he would spend that much time focused on our crime labs and fixing the failing crime labs, the DNA tests that prosecutors and law enforcement rely on across Wisconsin. That's what we need, an attorney general that's going to focus on public safety, not just talk about it. Again, that's why I have bipartisan support, Republicans and Democrats across Wisconsin that know we need a prosecutor and not a politician leading our Department of Justice.
Thank you, Mr.
When he says he'll enforce the law no matter what it was, that means that if Tim Michels signs legislation that prevents people from leaving the state or that bans abortions even to protect the health of the mother, he will prosecute people under that. That's what he's being very clear about. On top of that, when he says enforce the law, what he's missing is that our Department of Justice and all of our agencies have limited resources. They need to be prioritized. I think those priorities are fighting violent crime, fighting drug trafficking, not going after people for abortions. We have a clear disagreement on that, but to me, our resources need to go to fighting crime.
Thank you, Mr. Kaul. We're moving on. Next question from Will. We will start with Mr. Toney.
So, Mr. Toney, this week you charged your 8th person with election fraud. Mr. Kaul, your agency has charged a man with felonies for illegally requesting absentee ballots on behalf of Assembly Speaker Robin Vos and Racine Mayor Corey Mason. To both of you, we'll start with Mr. Toney. Was the 2020 election free, fair, and secure? And what role does the DOJ have in ensuring voters' confidence in the November 8th results this year?
I've been the most vocal statewide Republican candidate that we cannot decertify the election. It should not happen, and that there was no widespread voter fraud that would have overturned the results of the election. But I am prosecuting people for election fraud. We've already convicted 2 people from the November 2020 election, both of those convictions from a Tony Evers appointed judge. And the Attorney General has attacked me for one of those convictions where somebody came to Fond du Lac County that didn't even live in Fond du Lac County and voted. And we get that guidance from the very election manual that the Attorney General's office sends out year after year. And we talk about resources in the prior question. If he were serious about those resources, those special agents, the law enforcement positions wouldn't have been left vacant. The prosecutor positions would not have been left vacant. The crime lab wouldn't be in the situation it is. Law enforcement wouldn't be lined up behind me because of your public safety failures. We're tired. We want an attorney general that is going to prioritize public safety, not give it lip service as families want to feel safe in their homes.
Thank you, Mr. Toney. Mr. Kaul.
Well, first, I think it's important to note the question was about protecting democracy, and there is a fundamental difference in this race on that issue. My opponent has stood with Michael Gableman. He supported his investigation, which spent over $1 million of taxpayer resources investigating conspiracy theories. It was obviously biased and partisan from the start, and yet Mr. Toney recently appeared with Mr. Gableman at a fundraiser. Mr. Toney has also suggested that our election commissioners committed crimes and should be removed from office. At a time when our elections are under attack from people who are trying to overturn the results of the elections, we need an AG who we can count on to stand up for our democracy and protect the will of the voters. To answer the question you asked, our elections are free and fair and safe and secure. They have been repeatedly tested in statewide recount in 2016, in recounts of our 2 largest counties in 2020, in litigation after litigation, and I am proud that my office has successfully defended the will of the voters in case after case.
Thank you, Mr. Kaul. Mr. Toney, you have 30 seconds in rebuttal.
You brought up the 2016 recount where you were representing Hillary Clinton for that recount, arguing in court that we could not trust machines, that humans could better tell the intent of voters. That's what you argued in court. Candor to the court. That's not how you sound now. You also argued for a special counsel to investigate that election, which I think gave us all greater confidence. You did. You campaigned on it and demanded that Brad Schimmel advocate for special counsel. We have the tweet. We can send it to you if you'd like. We need an attorney general that's going to be serious and not a plastic bag blowing in the wind whatever direction their liberal politics blow.
Thank you, Mr. Toney. Our next question from Emily.
Now we're going to go to campaign ads. Now, of course, you both have ones out against each other, so these questions are going to be directed differently. I'm going to start with you, Mr. Kaul. The Republican Attorneys General Association has run an ad charging you didn't even, quote, show up when violent criminals were out and up for parole and left an empty chair in the room. Your opponent has run a TV ad featuring the mother of a girl killed in 1973 by the so-called Halloween killer. She charges that you weren't there for me at all in the 2018 when General Turner was set to be released. Now, it should be noted that you didn't take office until 2019, though there have been proceedings since then whether he is eligible for parole. How do you respond to the criticism your office has how do you respond to the criticism that your office hasn't been an advocate for crime victims at parole hearings?
Well, first, the Republican Attorneys General Association is a special interest group that cares about not having our environmental laws and consumer protection laws enforced. That's why they support my opponent, because they know he'll look the other way when those kinds of violations happen. With respect to Mr. Toney's ad, the truth of the matter is, first of all, Gerald Turner should have gotten a life sentence without the possibility of parole for that awful, awful crime. He should be behind bars and never be released. Unfortunately, that isn't what happened back in the 70s when that conviction took place. Throughout my administration, we have worked to keep Gerald Turner behind bars, and we have succeeded. He is behind bars today because of the work of our office and some work that came in 2018 before I took office. Now, Mr. Toney knows that, and yet he's willing to mislead the public about this. He's not part of this case. He has never reached out to me and said, can we help out your office with this case? He's never called and asked us to contact anybody. Our office has kept Gerald Turner behind bars, and that's exactly what we need to do to keep our community safe.
Thank you, Mr. Kaul. Mr. Toney?
Mr. Turner is not behind bars. He's in a locked unit for a violent sex offender petition that I helped initiate in 2018 under Attorney General Brad Schimmel. And I have talked to your office. I have received calls from the victim who doesn't feel that you've done a good enough job communicating with her. And that's how she feels, because of the failures of you. And this happened in Fond du Lac, where you're from, that you can't even be bothered to call her. We look at the Parole Commission. You've refused to speak out against Toney Evers and the commissioner releasing nearly 300 murderers and child rapists. Not every family gets justice. There are families in Milwaukee waiting for justice And these folks have had justice stolen from them, and you won't speak out for them and the voiceless that are no longer with us. And I will do that as Attorney General, like I have done as the District Attorney of Fond du Lac County, because I've lost track of how many families I've had to sit across from that have lost a loved one, and there's no sentence that can bring them back, but it's some small measure of justice.
Thank you, Mr. Toney. Mr. Kaul, 30 seconds.
When the Wisconsin State Journal endorsed my campaign, one of the things they pointed out is not just our track record of success. They also pointed out that Mr. Toney's attacks fall flat, and they specifically cited his parole attacks. The Wisconsin State Journal endorsed Brad Schimmel in 2018, I'm sorry. This election, they endorsed me. That is one example of our supporters, but also the National Sheriff's Association former president, DAs from blue counties, red counties, and purple counties, and 30 current and former mayors, the people responsible for ensuring that we're getting enough resources to our local law enforcement agencies, know that we need leadership that recognizes that.
Thank you, Mr. Kaul. We're going to stay with Emily for our next question.
Mr. Toney, this is for you about political ads. A Better Wisconsin Together Political Action Fund has been running a TV ad that says you have been in over your head as DA and your office let out a 9-time felon out of jail who then murdered a firefighter. No one in your office noticed that Reuben Houston III had changed his name and had previous felony convictions. Now, after Houston was released from the Fond du Lac County Jail and then turned over to the Marathon County authorities on unrelated warrant, he was released on a signature bond and days later killed an Appleton firefighter. How do you address this charge that your office failed in its handling of the case?
My office asked for high cash bail, $5,000 cash that he was held on. We objected to the signature bond request that the defense attorney made. It was the judge that lowered the cash bond, and the Attorney General has attacked me for this as well, but he hired the very prosecutor at the Department of Justice that handled this case, clearly not concerned about how that prosecutor handled the case, and was then released on a warrant to Marathon County, where he tragically, after being released, murdered a firefighter. We have prosecutors fighting for justice across Wisconsin. As the Attorney General attacks me on that case, he talks nothing about his office prosecuting one of those Darrell Brooks cases before that horrific massacre at the Waukesha Christmas Parade. I'm not interested in attacking frontline prosecutors. I'm interested in making sure we fight for public safety. That's why law enforcement is lined up behind me. Every single police chief in Fond du Lac County, my sheriff, 60 of our sheriffs across Wisconsin, over 100 police chiefs, sheriffs, and district attorneys that recognize we need a tough-on-crime prosecutor, and that's what my record is as the district attorney of Fond du Lac County.
Thank you, Mr. Toney. Mr. Kaul.
What you just heard was Mr. Toney trying to throw his former employee under the bus. It's not his employee who's at fault for this. It's the DA who's at fault for this. The buck stops with the DA. Here's what happened. Mr. Toney's office said in court that, first of all, they missed almost the entire record of that 9-time felon. And they said there needs to be some cash. And that's what the judge imposed, $500. They said his office said that the person didn't have much of a record. Less than 2 weeks later, he got into a shootout with police. He killed a firefighter, and he injured 2 other people, a police officer and a bystander. And this is a pattern of failures we've seen from Mr. Toney's DA's office. In felony domestic abuse prosecutions over a 6-year period, only 20% of those prosecutions resulted in felony convictions. That is far below the statewide average. It's well below the neighboring counties. The Department of Justice is almost 50 times larger than the Fond du Lac County DA's office. We can't have those kinds of failures magnified multiple times over at the Wisconsin Department of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Kaul. Mr. Toney, 30 seconds.
I don't think he managed a lemonade stand before he was elected Attorney General. I don't think you've ever prosecuted a domestic violence case to know that we are not driven by numbers. We're driven by the safety of the victim to make sure we get an outcome that protects them. When I took office, we were not in compliance with the state statute to prosecute those cases within 2 weeks. We put ourselves in compliance and directed one full attorney onto those positions. So don't lecture me about public safety in Wisconsin, because I've been in the trenches with our cops, with our prosecutors, and that's why they've lined up behind me, because of your public safety failures.
Thank you, Mr. Toney. Our next question from Will Keneally.
And this will be a question on concealed carry. We'll go to Mr. Kaul first. A unanimous state Supreme Court ruled earlier this year that a disorderly conduct conviction can't disqualify somebody from obtaining a concealed carry permit because it does not qualify as a misdemeanor crime for domestic abuse under federal law. Should the legislature pass a law to ensure that those convicted of disorderly conduct can't obtain a concealed carry permit?
When this happened on the day it came out, or maybe the day after, I talked to the press about this issue. We need to keep firearms out of the hands of people who we know are dangerous. We conduct background checks at the Department of Justice on most handgun sales in the state of Wisconsin, but there's a loophole that allows for private sales. I have called for it to be closed. Mr. Toney has not. I think that we should empower judges to issue orders to prevent people who've been shown to be a danger to themselves or others to temporarily restrict access to firearms. I support that. Mr. Toney does not. I have called to ensure that domestic abusers don't get firearms under that exact decision you mentioned. We need a legislative fix. I have called for a change. Mr. Toney hasn't. There was just data released about the number of domestic abuse homicides in Wisconsin. People are dying because dangerous people are able to get access to firearms. We need to close those loopholes.
Thank you, Mr. Kaul. Mr. Toney.
What we need to do is enforce the laws that we have on the books. You talk about someone that's a danger to themselves or others with a major mental illness that's treatable. Chapter 51 mental health commitment. The law is on the books where somebody can get in front of a judge within 72 hours, a jury trial within 2 weeks, and have their firearm rights taken from them. We need to enforce the law we have on the books. There's a slow-moving mass shooting going on through Milwaukee right now. Over 20 children murdered this year, a 12-year-old within the last week or so, a 5-year-old up in Green Bay. We have violent felons that do not care what the law is. I've prosecuted enough of them as a district attorney that have shot someone or shot at someone else, and they don't care what the law is. We need to make sure we are putting mandatory minimums on people that are using guns to commit violent crimes to make sure they know there are severe consequences here in Wisconsin to protect our communities, because we will not continue on this track record. I refuse to accept the violence that we're seeing in Milwaukee as the new normal. That's why I announced my campaign last year in Milwaukee.
You'll notice that Mr. Toney did not say he supports any common sense gun safety measures. When he talks about felons not following the law, of course that's true. The issue with universal background checks is the person selling the gun. If they're not conducting a background check, they don't know if the person they're selling to is a felon. People can literally sell guns out of the trunk of their cars right now, no matter who is trying to buy them. Mr. Toney has not been willing to stand up to the NRA and the gun lobby. He's been bragging about having their support. I think we need common sense measures that make our communities safer.
Thank you, Mr. Kaul. Our next question from J.R. Ross. We begin with Mr. Toney. Go ahead, J.R.
Mr. Toney, in July, your opponent filed a lawsuit against only 20 companies over PFAS contamination, often called forever chemicals. The suit against companies such as 3M seeks punitive damages as well as reimbursement for the cost of cleanup and remediation. If elected, would you continue that lawsuit?
You know, I have a record as a district attorney of protecting our environment. I'm a cross-country and track runner, love being outside. I've done 7 marathons. I will protect our water. I will protect our air. And we've protected our sturgeon population on Lake Winnebago. We've protected it against invasive species. And I was attacked for that during the Republican primary, and I did not back down. And so I will fight to protect our environment. And one thing we'll do is review every single case that's been filed to see what direction we're going to go. I'm not going to prejudge some cases that I haven't had a chance to look at all of the information, but I will protect our environment. I will work with our business leaders, our communities, the DNR to make sure that we're doing that, because we have to have clean water. We have to have clean air. That is what my record is as a district attorney, and that is what I will do as Attorney General.
Well, I'll point out that Mr. Toney, again, didn't answer your questions because I think the reality is that he's likely to withdraw Wisconsin from that suit. We'll see what he says. But holding PFAS companies accountable for the contamination they have caused is critical. I was in Marinette in 2019. I heard from people who have been impacted by this contamination, people who are afraid to give their kids water out of the tap. I heard from people who were worried that folks in their class in their 30s had gotten cancer because of PFAS contamination. Just recently, I heard from somebody who has MS, who said there was a disproportionate number of MS cases. I heard from a realtor who said, I can't sell houses if people don't feel safe to drink the water. I am going after those companies that are responsible for the contamination because we've got to clean those toxic, cancer-causing chemicals out of our water. And when we do it, it's the companies that made millions of dollars in profits that should pay to clean it up, not Wisconsin taxpayers. I've committed to that. Mr. Toney has not.
Mr. Toney, you have 30 seconds.
The difference is I've committed to enforcing the rule of law, not just when I agree, not just when it's popular. So what I've said is I will evaluate each case. to make sure that we're following the law, and we will protect and defend our environment here in Wisconsin, just like I've done as the district attorney of Fond du Lac County. That's why I have broad support across Wisconsin. I visited all 72 counties during this campaign. Last week, Thursday, 721 miles, 11 hours and 36 minutes to hit my final 4 counties. I've seen all of Wisconsin. I've met with voters, and I will defend our environment as our Attorney General.
Thank you, Mr. Toney. Emily has our next question.
Gentlemen, we're going to turn to opioids. Mr. Kaul, you are first. This is kind of a double question, so you both will answer this. Mr. Kaul, you have touted your record of the state joining and winning opioid lawsuits. Mr. Toney, you have mentioned that the state needs to take an all-of-the-above approach to the opioid epidemic. Gentlemen, both of you, but Kaul, you can answer first. What would you do for these next 4 years to lead the DOJ, if reelected, when it comes to tackling the opioid epidemic?
Well, first, I do think we need to take an all-of-the-above approach, and that's what we've done at the Wisconsin Department of Justice. We have investigated and prosecuted drug traffickers. We were one of the agencies that investigated large-scale drugs coming from Puerto Rico to Milwaukee, for example. We also put people behind bars for importing more than about 20 pounds of meth into Wisconsin. We've also worked to hold big pharmaceutical companies accountable. That's a big difference in this race. You haven't heard my opponent talk about that at all. We've helped secure over $400 million, and we are continuing to work to hold big pharma accountable. We've also got to make sure that we are expanding access to treatment for people who are struggling with substance use disorder. We have expanded the treatment alternatives and diversion program during my time in office, but we need to go a lot further. My Safer Wisconsin plan calls for additional funding for mental health treatment and for substance use disorder treatment. And then we've got to continue making people aware of the dangers of opioids and now fentanyl in particular. We've had some of the most successful drug takebacks in the country. We're also working with the Department of Health Services to get the word out about the dangers. We need to keep doing that.
Thank you, Mr. Kaul. Mr. Toney.
You know, I've done one of those Len Bias homicide trials during this campaign. I've actually done 3 murder trials, including being in one over the primary election. I have fought in the trenches to lock up dangerous criminals that peddle poison, that kill kids in our streets. I started an opioid coalition in Fond du Lac County, a 4-pillar approach that we merged with our drug-free communities. I helped bring a drug court to Fond du Lac County. We expanded our diversion program to do more drug testing. You know, under former Attorney General Brad Schimmel and Governor Walker, there was a statewide opioid task force. If you go on that website right now, it still lists former Lieutenant Governor Rebecca Clayfish and Attorney General Brad Schimmel. That needs to be restarted, bringing community partners and law enforcement and agencies across Wisconsin together. It hasn't happened on his watch, and he tries to take credit for this lawsuit against the opioid manufacturers. In a Wisconsin State Journal story, there were a number of county executives that said the Attorney General didn't swoop in until the 11th hour when it looked like there was going to be a settlement. So our county executives certainly don't feel like they've had that support.
This is another good example of Mr. Toney not understanding the work of the Department of Justice. We were conducting a separate investigation from those county executives. It was a different investigation. The states themselves worked to resolve that. So of course the county execs didn't know because they weren't part of that part of the investigation. What you did not hear him talk about, though, was holding Big Pharma accountable. Because again, these corporate special interests that are supporting the attack ads you mentioned before against me, they want Mr. Toney to win because they don't want somebody who's going to stand up for all Wisconsinites. They want somebody who's going to do their bidding in the AG's office.
Thank you, Mr. Kaul. We have one final question. You'll have 30 seconds left for each of these. No rebuttal. JR.
Numerous lawsuits have been filed over election procedures in Wisconsin.
For what, I'm sorry?
Over election procedures in Wisconsin, particularly the handling of absentee ballots. Are you confident in the standards now in place for administering the 2022 election, and will you commit to accepting the results?
I commit to accepting the results, and we have made progress here in Wisconsin where we have to make sure every ballot is treated and counted the same in Wisconsin, regardless of where the votes are cast, because elections are the cornerstone of our democracy and our republic, and I will defend the integrity of our elections. I've done it as a district attorney. I will do it as our attorney general, because if we don't have confidence in our elections, it erodes our democracy and our republic, and I will defend it.
Mr. Kaul, 30 seconds.
Yeah, absolutely we need to accept the results. We have safe, secure, free, and fair elections. Everybody in elected office needs to be talking about this fact, because there are people like Michael Gableman, who my opponent has stood with, who have made all sorts of false, baseless claims, who have even called for decertification. We need an AG who's going to stand up for our democracy, not stand with Michael Gableman.
It's time now for our closing statements. Based on the coin flip, Mr. Kaul, you have 1 minute. You have the first closing statement.
Well, first, let me again thank you for hosting this debate. Thank you to our moderators. Our Department of Justice does incredible work for the people of Wisconsin, and I am so proud that during my time in office, we have investigated and prosecuted some of the most serious crimes in the state. We've worked to reform our sexual assault kit laws, hold big pharmaceutical companies accountable for their role in the opioid epidemic, make our schools safer, and hold polluters accountable. We need to keep building on the progress we've been making, and I have proposed concrete plans for public safety. My Safer Wisconsin plan and my crime-fighting budget would invest significantly in public safety. I've called for an increase in shared revenue, dollars that go from the state to local governments to help fund public safety. My opponent has offered zero solutions for funding public safety and law enforcement in Wisconsin. We also need an attorney general who is going to be on the side of reproductive freedom. I am challenging the 19th century ban with no exceptions. My opponent has said, although today he's disputed it, that he would like DAs to be able to cross county lines to prosecute abortion cases. Those are the wrong priorities for Wisconsin.
Thank you, Mr. Kaul. Mr. Toney, 1 minute for a closing statement.
Public safety is on the ballot. Anybody that's watching this debate can go to my website and you'll probably see a sheriff, a district attorney, or a police association that is lined up behind me overwhelmingly to make sure that we have an attorney general that will make public safety the #1 priority. That's what my record has been as a district attorney, the president of the bipartisan Wisconsin District Attorneys Association, Republican, Democrat, sheriffs, and DAs across Wisconsin that want someone they trust to help keep our communities safe. That's what I will do as our Attorney General. I will never allow the DCI agent positions, the prosecutor positions to go to disrepair, where we've seen a consequence with those sex predator cases that our Attorney General has failed to have assigned out with a backlog of over 1,000 that he refuses to answer. The crime labs taking longer in many categories on his watch when that was his #1 campaign promise. Anybody knows when you fail at the #1 thing you say you'll do at work, you're going to get fired, and I'd be honored to have your vote on November 8th.
Thank you, Mr. Toney. I want to thank both of our candidates for their participation. You guys were excellent on time as well. Thank you so much. I want to thank our audience here as well, and of course our panelists for coming up with these excellent questions today. The debate has been sponsored by the State Bar of Wisconsin. Thank you for being our host today, along with WisPolitics.com and WISC TV here in Madison. Election Day is Tuesday, November 8th. We encourage you to exercise your right as an American, have your voice heard, and vote on Election Day. Thank you for joining us.